Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the third webinar in our ABAWD webinar training series. My name is Amber Bonilla, and I am a manager in the CalFresh policy section over the ABAWD policy unit. And I'm joined today by Alexis Fernandez, who is the CalFresh policy section chief, as well as ABAWD policy analyst Denise Gellinger. And I'd also like to introduce today our newest team member, Danielle Watkins-McGee, who's recently joined the ABAWD policy unit as a policy analyst. So you'll be hearing from her as well as Sydney for all things ABAWD. So we'd like to thank everyone for joining us this morning. Last time we discussed the importance of effectively screening individuals for exemptions from the ABAWD time limit. And as we mentioned, effective exemption screening is one of the most important components of implementing the ABAWD time limit. Effective exemption screening ensures that individuals who are subject to the time limit are required to satisfy the work requirement, and if an individual is not exempt and subject to the time limit, that they must meet the work requirement. As a reminder, the requirement is to participate in work or qualifying work activity for 20 hours per week or 80 hours per month on average, and we'll get into that a little more deeply throughout this presentation. Today we'll be taking an in-depth look on how ABAWDs who are subject to the time limit can satisfy that ABAWD work requirement. And as a quick reminder, if you missed the first two webinars, that's okay. They were recorded, and the recordings have been posted to the CalFresh website. I know we had technical challenges with the exemptions webinar, so I will be sending out that recording soon. We had to do a little bit of magic to get that recording prepared. So once it's ready, I'll be sending that out via email. Our contact information is also available at the end of the presentation, so if you have any questions or did not receive a copy of the recording, please let either myself, Danielle, or Sydney know, and we will get you that information. Today's webinar will be hosted in listen-only mode, and there's two ways to listen in, either via computer or via phone. Information on how to connect is located on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you'd like to ask questions, we reserved some time at the end of the presentation for a Q&A session. So if you'd like to submit a question, you can enter it using the question box throughout the webinar presentation at any time. At the end of the presentation, we'll be addressing as many questions as time permits. And any questions that we're not able to get to, we will be keeping a record of all questions asked in order to inform future webinars coming up in the next few months, and also to inform a Q&A document that we're hoping to release in the next few months as well. And we'll do our best to answer questions offline. I'm kind of acting as MC today as well as presenter, so I'll try to do my best to answer questions as I see them come in. And again, this webinar will be recorded and available after the presentation. I did send a copy of the PowerPoint ahead of time just about 20 minutes ago, so hopefully that was received. If not, please let me know and I'll send it to you after the presentation ends. So as we've stated in previous webinars, the return of the ABAWD time limit is one of the most significant and complicated policy changes to impact CalFresh in quite some time. It's very complex, and for that reason, it's important that we proactively plan and prepare for implementation. This is why CDSS has launched the ABAWD webinar training series. So this chart shows just a quick overview of what we have planned for in the next few months. Each webinar in the series is meant to provide our partners with a starting point in developing their understanding of the ABAWD time limit, as well as to aid in the development of your own trainings. Next month, we'll be hosting a webinar on accurately counting months to determine whether an ABAWD subject to the time limit has satisfied the work requirement or not. And this will be followed by regaining eligibility, a presentation on 15% exemption policy, and ending the series with the ABAWD clock, reporting, and meds in January. So on today's agenda, we'll briefly revisit California's implementation timeline and do a very quick review of the ABAWD time limit. And from there, we'll discuss ways in which individuals can satisfy the ABAWD work requirement in depth and discuss some county and community partner takeaways and end everything with a short Q&A session. So while some of this information may be familiar if you joined us in our last webinar, we did want to start off with a recap of the important dates that are coming up so we can level set for everyone who's joining us today. So it's important that we're all on the same page regarding where we are in our pre-implementation efforts and where we're heading. As we mentioned last time, we're now 1 year away from implementation, but as we all know, that's not as much time as we think, and implementation really is just around the corner. So on January 1 of this year, we officially started our new fixed statewide clock option for ABAWDs, and again, this means that each ABAWD has the same 36-month period. Since then, our various ABAWD work groups and committees have been meeting regularly to work through key policy issues, draft the ABAWD handbook, and develop new NOAAs, forms, tools for ABAWD clients. And this work culminates this month in September with the anticipated release of our ABAWD policy handbook. And upon release of the policy handbook, consortia will begin automation planning. So looking ahead to 2018, the work groups and trainings will continue, and counties should begin planning any necessary business process changes and trainings that they may need. For those of you who participate in one or more of our work groups, please be on the lookout for an email from me this week, as we'll be reconvening those groups to discuss processes moving forward. If you're interested in joining a work group, please feel free to send me an email and I will add you to the distribution list. And I can also get you more information on which work groups we have available. So in roughly February to March of 2018, CDSS will be submitting our next waiver request to FNS. And while we do know this won't be a statewide waiver, at this point it's unclear which counties may lose time limit waiver eligibility. As a reminder, the waiver request is based on 24 months of unemployment data, which is not yet available. So 6 months ahead of implementation, we enter a critical phase of preparation. And at this point in time, counties should have a sense of their time limit waiver eligibility and whether or not they will be required to implement the ABAWD time limit. And as we mentioned last time, on September 1 of 2018, the statewide waiver will expire and some counties will be required to implement the time limit. Communication with clients, including exemption screening, which we discussed in the last webinar, and notification about the time limit rule should happen well in advance of September 1, 2018. And also for those counties required to implement, participation tracking will begin at that time. Looking forward from there, in December of 2018, we'll have wrapped up year 2 in our first 36-month period, and the first wave of ABAWDs who are subject to the time limit may potentially be discontinued due to exhaustion of their 3 countable months. So here we are revisiting our population diagram again to show how we've narrowed in our population at this point in the series to ABAWD individuals who are subject to the time limit and do not meet exemption criteria. So from here, we're going to discuss ways in which these individuals can satisfy the work requirements. So I'm going to pass it off now to Sydney Stellinger, who is an ABAWD policy analyst in the ABAWD unit, she's going to start with a quick review of the ABAWD time limit rule.
All right, good morning, everyone. As a quick review, ABAWD eligibility is limited to 3 full months within a 36-month period. while not fulfilling the work requirement are otherwise exempt. This time limit rule applies to individuals who are 18 to 49, have no dependents, and do not qualify for an exemption. The time limit rule requires ABAWDs to work or participating in a qualifying work activity for at least 20 hours per week or 80 hours per month averaged. And so here we are about satisfying the work requirement. There are many options available for ABAWDs who are subject to the time limit to satisfy the work requirement. This includes, but is not limited to, employment or participating in a qualifying work activity, such as work fair, education and employment, participating in a qualifying work activity such as CalFresh employment and training, WIOA programs, programs under Section 236 of the Trade Act of 1974, and community service and volunteer work. As you can see, ABAWDs have options for satisfying the work requirement. However, regardless of the option, ABAWDs subject to the time limit must satisfy the work requirement for required numbers of hours, 20 hours per week or 80 hours averaged monthly. Of course, there's always an exception to the rule, which we'll be discussing in this presentation. But first, we're going to talk about employment. An ABAWD can satisfy the work requirement through employment, which includes paid employment, self-employment, and in-kind employment. In-kind employment means work in exchange for goods and services, and some examples are performing maintenance work in exchange for reduced housing costs, babysitting in exchange for toiletries or other household items, or painting a neighbor's house in exchange for mechanical repairs on a vehicle, for example. You're required to have 20 hours per week or 80 hours a month, which this can be combined with other qualifying work activities. So let's talk about what all this means. Participation in an allowable work activity or a combination of allowable work activities to satisfy the work requirement. This can include CalFresh employment and training, programs under the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, programs under Section 236 of the Trade Act of 1976, community service, or volunteer work. Now let's explore these options. We will explore in depth starting with employment and training, and Amber will be giving a brief overview of this program.
Yeah, so we just wanted to quickly review CalFresh E&T. So participation in CalFresh E&T allows ABAWDs to keep their CalFresh benefits and also to learn skills to obtain gainful employment. And so while this may not solve the challenge of implementing the time limit, having those robust skills-based E&T programs may be a good fit for ABAWDs who are in need of job and career training opportunities. So the E&T program provides increased opportunities for ABAWDs by bringing together some of the most promising workforce programs with funding that is focused on low-income individuals, and it really provides opportunities for ABAWDs to make a real difference in their lives. It also provides access to services which may not be as easily accessible through other avenues, and federal funding is available for CalFresh E&T. Participation in E&T components in order to satisfy the work requirement also requires 20 hours per week or 80 hours per month on average, and is for the most part combinable with other qualifying activities. We'll discuss, as we mentioned, there's exceptions to every rule, so we'll discuss some of the options with workfare that are a little bit different. So E&T components that satisfy the work requirement are referred to as qualifying activities, as Sydney briefly mentioned, and components that do not satisfy the work requirement are referred to as non-qualifying activities. So qualifying activities consist of workfare, work experience, self-initiated workfare, education, and vocational training. And again, this is not a comprehensive list. There are also other components. And non-qualifying ENT activities consist of standalone job search and job club components. But although an important note here is that hours spent in job search that are offered in combination with another ENT component will count towards the ABAWD time limit, the ABAWD work requirement, providing that the time in the job search component consists of less than half of the combined total. So in a nutshell, what that means is that you can use job search in combination with other ENT components for up to 9 hours to satisfy the work requirement.
All right, thank you for that overview of the CalFresh ENT program. Another qualifying work activity is the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Program. WIOA is designed to help job seekers access employment, education, training, and support services to succeed in the labor market and to match employers with skilled workers that they need to compete in the economy. WIOA programs include job search, occupational skills training, on-the-job training, job readiness training, and adult education and literacy pro activities. Please note that the job search through WIOA can be used to meet all 20 hours of the work requirement weekly. And this program can also be combined with other qualifying activities that we've talked about so far, as long as it's 20 hours per week or 80 hours per month. Another program that we have is the Trade Act of 1974, which applies to workers identified by the Employment Development Department as adversely affected by the U.S. trade agreement. This program under Section 236 provides training to affect workers through participation in programs subject to approval by the Secretary of the U.S. Department of Labor. These programs include job search, job club, on-the-job training, WIOA training, and remedial education programs. Like before, these programs require 20 hours per week or 80 hours a month and can be combined with other qualifying activities. Next, we're going to be discussing community service and volunteer work. Clients can use volunteer work or community service hours to meet the work requirements. This can include volunteer work at a local church, Red Cross, nonprofit agency, or any other community-based organization. Clients have the option to find and choose where they would like to complete their volunteer work. However, the volunteer agency must be willing to verify hours worked. A verification form is in progress, but this can also include a verification form provided directly from the agency. Like all the programs we discussed before, an ABAWD must work 20 hours per week or 80 hours per month, and this also can be combined with the programs we've talked about before. All right. As we have briefly touched on the past few slides, we want to make sure that it's clear that all the ways to satisfy the work requirements that we've discussed up to this point can be combined to meet the 20-hour per week and 80-hour per month requirements. The only exception is workfare, which we'll be discussing in just a few minutes. Being able to combine work hours allows for flexibility for the ABAWD individual to satisfy the work requirement, and also allows for increased county engagement. For example, an individual can work 15 hours per week in paid employment and participate in an allowable activity for the remaining 5 hours to qualify and satisfy the work requirement. All right. A final way a client may satisfy the ABAWD work requirement is through participation in workfare. There are various types of workfare, including CalFresh ENT workfare, self-initiated workfare, and a comparable non-ENT workfare activities, including general assistance workfare activities approved by the CWD. The requirement to work 20 hours per week or 80 hours a month does not apply to workfare. For workfare, the required number of monthly hours is calculated by dividing the CalFresh allotment by the higher of the state or local minimum wage, rounded down to the nearest hour. Often the hours required for workfare assignments will be less than the 20 hours per week and 80 hours per month average required by the ABAWD work requirement. And this is due to the higher minimum wage in California. Another important note regarding workfare is that the client is not required to report if they do not complete the assigned hours, because this information is already known to the county, as the county is required to monitor eligibility and compliance. Now, I know this was a lot of information for one slide, and on the next few slides we'll be going over a few examples of workfare. Example 1, workfare hours calculation. Sarah is an ABAWD living in Sacramento County, where the state minimum wage is $10.50, my brain, which is the same as the city and the county. She received a CalFresh allotment of $150. To calculate her required number of workfare hours, the CWD must divide her CalFresh allotment by 150 by the minimum wage of $10.50, which equals 14.29 hours, which will be rounded down to 14 hours of workfare per month to satisfy the work requirement. Our next example is calculating city versus county minimum wage. In this example, Joe also receives a $150 monthly CalFresh allotment. However, he lives in the city of Emeryville, which has a city minimum wage of $15.20 per hour. Because the city minimum wage of Emeryville is higher than both the state of California minimum wage of $10.50 and the Alameda County minimum wage of $12, the CWD would use the city of Emeryville's higher minimum wage for the purpose of calculating the required number of workfare hours for Joe, because this is where Joe's physical address is. So once again, after rounding down, Joe must complete 9 hours of workfare per month to satisfy the work requirement. Example 3 we have is a multi-person workfare household. In this third example, we have a household of 2 where both of the members are ABAWD subject to the time limit. John and Stephanie receive a CalFresh allotment of $150 a month. Using the state minimum wage of $10.50, we determine that the total number of workfare hours required is 14 hours per month. In this example, the 14 hours of workfare applies to the entire household, not each member individually. Together, John and Stephanie must complete a total number of 14 hours per month. This could be satisfied by John working 8 hours and Stephanie working 6 hours, or any other combination, as long as the total number of workfare hours for the household completed equals the amount required for that household. Now that we have gone over how to satisfy, ways to satisfy the work requirement, Amber will be discussing good costs.
Great, thank you, Sydney. So ABAWD subject to the time limit who would have satisfied the work requirement but did not do so for reasons that are outside of their control may be granted good cause. Good cause must be determined on a case-by-case basis, and the month in which good cause is established is not considered a countable month, even though the individual did not meet the ABAWD work requirement. So good cause can be established for, but not limited to, any of the following reasons: illness, either personal or of another household member, a household emergency, or lack of transportation. And as a reminder, CWDs should assess for good cause prior to applying a countable month, a 15% exemption, or a discontinuance. And there is a unique tracking code available in MEDS for a good cause determination that will be used, and we'll discuss that in more detail in a later webinar. And then, as always, good cause provisions can be found at the following MPP sections, which I can link for folks as well. So a quick note about verification of satisfying the work requirement: it must be obtained at initial application, *7, and recertification. Verification is mandatory, but there is, as with most verification requirements, flexibility on how it's obtained. It can be through wage stubs, collateral contacts, for folks using community service as their ABAWD work requirement satisfaction. They can use the community service verification form, which will be available hopefully here shortly. We have it in draft. And then client statement in some cases may be appropriate. And just as another note, if a client does not provide verification that they're satisfying the work requirement, they will begin to accrue countable months. And there's also an additional required mid-period report for ABAWD, subject to the time limit, with the exception of workfare. ABAWD subject to the time limit are required to report to the county mid-period when their hours drop below an average of 20 hours or 80 hours, 20 hours per week or 80 hours per month within 10 days. CWDs will be required to take action on all mandatory reports, which could result in one, reevaluation of exemption status. So even though at this point we have determined that this person is subject to the time limit, meaning they initially did not meet exemption criteria, they may still meet criteria for an exemption later in the certification period. So it's important to reevaluate and continue that exemption screening process. It could also result in a good cause determination if they had reasons outside of their control for not meeting the work requirement. It may result in the use of a 15% exemption or application of a countable month. And if the circumstances arise, application of the 3 consecutive months, which we'll also talk about in a later webinar. And finally, it could result in a discontinuance. So key discussion points that we've identified for CWDs and CBOs is to, one, start by asking how will counties and CBOs identify and individually assess ABAWDs meeting the work requirement? How can counties and CBOs engage ABAWDs in qualifying work activities? What challenges will there be in finding workfare or volunteer sites? What programs currently exist in your county that can help ABAWDs satisfy the work requirement? And are there enough spaces available? Also, how can community partnerships help ABAWDs to satisfy the work requirement? So that concludes our presentation and brings us to our Q&A. So at this time, we'll open the session for questions. As a reminder, please post your questions in the question box, and I will do my best. I'm going to try to open it now without messing up the screen. One second, Alexis is showing how to pull it. Oh, right there. Okay, great, thank you. So if you could bear with me for just a few minutes, and I'll start sorting through some of these questions.
While Amber does that, this is Alexis jumping in on a logistical issue. We're aware that some of the slides were cut off at the bottom of the screen during the live presentation, but the slides will be made available via PowerPoint, and so you'll have the full slide, and we will resolve that issue for the next webinar.
Yes. Thank you. Great. So I'm seeing a question come in asking what is a 15% exemption, and just wanted to flag that we will be devoting an entire webinar to the 15% exemption and policies surrounding that topic. A really brief, just quick overview of what the 15% exemption is it's just it's an exemption that is provided by FNS to CDSS annually when we are not under a statewide waiver. And there's maximum flexibility in how those exemptions are used. So right now, one of the things the work group is working on is creating statewide exemption policy on how to apply those. But one 15% exemption is equal to 1 month of CalFresh benefits for one ABAWD individual. So again, we'll be going into a deep dive into that policy at a later webinar. And then another question I'm seeing is, does student participation meet the workfare requirement? And I'm thinking that question is really, does student participation meet the ABAWD work requirement? And actually, if students are enrolled in an education program for at least half-time, that's actually a work registration exemption. So they would not be subject to the time limit. They would be exempt under work registration. Sure. Alexis is going to take over emceeing for me for just a second while we comb through some of these questions. Another question that came up was, are we required to check ABAWD work hour compliance monthly? And under simplified reporting, the answer for that is no, that we cannot check ABAWD hour compliance each month. The only requirement is that they report to us mid-period when their work hours drop below 20 hours per week or an average of 80 hours per month within 10 days.
All right, here's another question. Amber, could you go into a little bit more detail about how the 20-hour per week requirement can be averaged over the month?
Sure. So, for example, some people may work, have some flexibility in their hours. So if they work, let's say 18 hours one week, but then they work 22 hours the next, you can average those 2 weeks to say that, yes, this person did work an average of 20 hours a week. It doesn't necessarily have to be exactly 20 hours so long as on average it's equal to 20 or 80 per month.
Okay, this next question is with regards to workfare and the minimum wage, which is used specifically to calculate the number of workfare hours that are required. Okay. The question is, if Joe lives in Emeryville, so Emeryville is his city of residence, okay, but works in a different city with a different minimum wage, do we use the minimum wage from the city he is living in?
Yes. So what we're using is his city where he lives. So even if he is working anywhere else in the county of Alameda, he will be using the minimum wage in Emeryville because that is where his physical address is.
So I think here a point of clarification is that this formula is only used in the situation where a client has chosen workfare as an activity to satisfy the work requirement. It cannot be combined with any other activity. So only when the person is selecting workfare and only when we're determining the workfare hours required do you need to investigate the minimum wage for their city of residence. In no other situation does the minimum wage impact your calculation because it is about hours worked, not income earned. So again, it's unique to workfare, and in that case, you can only do workfare. It cannot be combined with other activities.
I'm seeing another good question, Alexa, if I can jump in. This question is, a customer is doing community service for parole or probation and not necessarily on a work release, but he's doing 40 hours per week for this requirement. Could this potentially meet the work requirements for mandatory ABAWD, or can the customer be granted good cause for not meeting the work requirement? And the answer is yes, that the hours worked in community service as part of their parole or probation can count as working and meeting the work requirements. They still do need to be verified, but that absolutely would count to satisfy the ABAWD work requirement.
All right, here's another question specifically about the option to participate in a program under the Trade Act of 1974. Does an ABAWD subject to the time limit have to participate in that program under the Trade Act for 20 hours to meet the ABAWD requirement?
Yes, it can be in combination with other activities, but yes, the only exception to the 20-hour rule is workfare participation. So any other program, or employment or education activity would have to equal 20 hours per week or an average of 80 hours per month.
All right. This next question, are there still work requirement deferrals? And if so, where do they fit in with ABAWD exemptions? I'll go ahead and take that one. So yes, just as baseline information for folks on the line, California does have in state statute a few work requirement deferrals, and those apply in circumstances where a county has chosen to implement a mandatory work program. And today, there are no mandatory work programs in California. That is different, though related, to the current ABAWD work time limit and corresponding work requirement. So for individuals subject to the time limit, they are required to meet the work requirement, but none of the options are mandatory. And that's the tricky part of this rule. You have to meet the work requirement. We're going to give you options for how to do that. If you choose none of those options, then you may not be able to maintain eligibility. But as of today, no county will be requiring a particular activity to meet the work requirement. So we can definitely talk more about that if there are additional questions, but those two topics are somewhat related yet distinctly different from each other.
So another question that I'm seeing is, what is the total monthly hours needed in the month of application? So let's say if the client came in after the 1st, which I assume happens often, what hours requirement is needed for that initial month? And the answer is that actually would be considered a partial month, and partial months do not count towards the ABAWD time limit. So the client, if they were subject to the time limit, would not have to meet the work requirement in that initial month as long as it's a partial month of benefit.
Okay, here's another question for you. Is are work for hours a weekly amount or a monthly amount?
The work for hours are actually monthly because of how you calculate it. You're going to take your monthly CalFresh allotment and divide it by the highest minimum wage available, and that will be the applicant's monthly hours that they have to complete.
All right, I'm just going to take a pause here to acknowledge I'm having some technical difficulties with the slides, but we're going to keep working through some questions here. So those slides will be sent via email, so don't worry about getting the slides accurately in PowerPoint version. Okay. All right. This is another question about workfare. Can a county assign workfare to an ABAWD who is not exempt, so therefore they are subject to the time limit, they are not meeting the work requirement at the time of application, and the question is, can the county assign workfare to the ABAWD? I'll go ahead and take this one, and at this time we are, most ENT programs are, no, all ENT programs in California are voluntary. So if it's CalFresh ENT Workfare, those are voluntary programs. So you give the ABAWD the option to participate in Workfare in order to satisfy the work requirement. And CDSS would encourage counties to continue the practice of making Workfare a voluntary option. So again, along with all the other options we've discussed today, you engage with the ABAWD, assess what is the best fit for them, and then offer them options to satisfy the work requirement if they're not doing so when they apply with you. So definitely Workfare should be an option that is considered in the lead up to implementation, making sure you have that available, as it is a good fit for some ABAWDs, but there are a range as we discussed today. Okay, I'm going to give folks just a minute here to submit additional questions if they have them. There are a couple here that we're going to follow up with folks after the webinar, but keep those coming in. All right, here's a good question. A crisscross of policy issues, which I think we experience very often here in CalFresh. So, can you please explain one more time the question about student eligibility? From what our participant understands, the education can count towards the exemption to time limit rules, but students still need to meet the student exemptions to be eligible. Is that correct? So if you can explain a little bit more about the overlap.
Sure. Students is definitely not my area, but I will do my best to answer this question. And the answer is that is correct, that you can use education activities to meet the work requirement, but student eligibility rules do still apply. So they would need to meet an exemption in order to be an eligible student. And potentially, if they meet that exemption as an eligible student, they may also have an ABAWD exemption. So this would be a case where it's particularly important to evaluate closely for ABAWD exemptions. But yes, you can use education and training activities, classes, of things of that nature to satisfy the work requirement, so long as all other eligibility criteria is met.
And going back to the comment about the relationship between college students and work registration, so let's go back to our bubbles, and you have your general CalFresh population and you have work registrants before you even get to whether someone is an ABAWD. And students who are attending school more than half-time are exempt from work registration. Therefore, we don't move forward with implementing the ABAWD time limit and corresponding work requirements. That said, the college student eligibility rules still stand, so that individual may have another set of CalFresh rules applied to them. The point we were making is that the ABAWD time limit rules would not be applied to them. So they don't get off scot-free, they're not guaranteed to be eligible, but for today's purposes, that exemption from work registration means they are not an ABAWD subject to the time limit. Okay, we'll give folks a few more minutes here. Okay, so this is a question going back to participation in a WIOA program. And the question is, do you have to be registered or enrolled in the WIOA program for it to count?
Yes. To be in the WIOA program, you do have to register and participate and be in that specific program.
Yeah.
For all of those eligibilities to apply and to count.
Yeah. And that participation should be verified so that we know, as just like WIOA or the Trade Act programs or another employment and training program that possibly is not WIOA or Trade Act, you need to verify that you're participating. And in the case of WIOA, that may mean registration or enrollment, but we need to make sure that you are actually actively participating in that program, or you may not satisfy the hourly requirement.
Right.
All right, and here's another question along those lines, just to clarify. Vocational training can be combined with education so long as the 20 hours per week requirement is met. Is that correct?
Yes. Sorry, so that's too low. Yes, that's correct.
Yes, so again, and I know we sound like a broken record, but the message here is that you can combine hours across qualifying work activities and paid employment to help an ABAWD get to the 20 hours per week or 80 hours average monthly requirement. Okay, here's another thought/comment, and I'm glad that folks brought it up. Is policy or CalFresh policy here at CDSS working with state-level outreach to help identify workfare volunteer sites to refer ABAWDs? And yes, this is a great point for two reasons. First, to say that the state is definitely looking at ways to maximize our relationships with community service organizations and community-based organizations that may have slots available. It's also a great point for folks to be thinking about locally. what relationships do you already have in your community with CBOs, with outreach partners that may help you in establishing options for your ABAWD clients. So community service options, volunteer work options, work fair sites, expanding your work fair program with community-based organizations, all work that we all need to do, the state and our county partners, our local partners, to make sure that we're ready come September 2018 and moving forward, right? So even if those aren't set up as of September 2018, you should keep on trucking toward that goal, because we will have ABAWD subject to the time limit in waves. So definitely be planning toward implementation in your county. Okay. Oh, lots of questions have come in. Just give me a moment here. Okay, here's another clarification around workfare. So if a customer has chosen to use workfare to satisfy the work requirement, and it turns out that their monthly requirement is 14 hours per month, does this mean that they don't have to meet the 20 hours per week requirement?
Yes, that's exactly what it means. So as we discussed, there's two different kinds of ways to satisfy the work requirement. You have work requirement, which is what you have to divide the monthly allotment by the minimum wage, and then you have all the other ones, which is 20 hours per week or 80 hours a month. So for workfare, it is only that per month. For example, 14 hours a month if you're using the state minimum wage. And that is all they have to do to satisfy the work requirement.
So workfare is distinctly different from our other options, paid employment or qualifying work activities. And the workfare hours cannot be combined with our other hours. You actually don't need to combine them, so long as you've met the requirement determined under workfare formula.
Right.
Great, thank you. This is another question on the hot topic of workfare. Are all CalFresh employment and training programs considered workfare? So no, there is a workfare option under CalFresh Employment and Training. So a county that has a CalFresh Employment and Training program can offer workfare through that program. A county can also offer workfare outside of its CalFresh Employment and Training program. To go a step further, the CalFresh ENT program officially has a variety of components, we call them. So job search is a type of CalFresh ENT component. Workfare is a type of CalFresh ENT component. And so not all components are workfare, but workfare can be part of your CalFresh ENT program. And I'm happy if folks are interested to connect you with our CalFresh ENT unit to think more about how that program can be expanded through workfare or other components so that you're ready and able to serve all ABAWDs who come your way. Okay. So Amber, if you could give us an example of when a client statement may be an acceptable verification to determine whether an ABAWD has satisfied the work requirement.
Yeah, so for this one, I was thinking like a self-employment situation may be appropriate, because remember, we're just verifying hours worked for the purpose of determining that they're satisfying the work requirements. So a self-employment situation may be in-kind work as well. I did briefly want to mention that I think I skipped over during the presentation that just as we said with the exemptions webinar, that you do, the gold standard of verification is documentary evidence. So as much as you can secure like a document or some kind of piece of paper or a form to show that the person is indeed satisfying the work requirement, there are situations where client statement would be okay, which is, as I mentioned, self-employment or in-kind work, and that the CWD should be thinking of ways in which they can help clients obtain documentary evidence if available, but otherwise there is some flexibility just as with exemption.
Great, thank you, Amber. So here's another important question I think many probably are wondering. So with clients only having to provide work hour verification at application, SAR-7, and recertification, will we be asking for proof of work hours for all months? Or, and I think Amber will speak to our required reporting requirements, so go ahead, Amber.
Yes, so under simplified reporting, we are not allowed to ask ABAWD clients to verify work hours for each month. The only two required reports under simplified reporting are income received over the income reporting threshold, and for ABAWD subject to the time limit, a drop in work hours below 20 hours per week or 80 hours per month. So we cannot impose additional reporting requirements on ABAWD individuals.
So definitely the need to verify work hours at application and SAR-7 and recertification, but the responsibility to let you know that the hours have dropped below 20 and therefore there might be a question of continuing eligibility is on the client.
Yes, correct.
Great. Okay. This next question, is there a tool that we can provide to our clients to give them contact information on qualifying work activities or local CBOs who may have volunteer opportunities available, and will that tool be developed? This is definitely a great tool that I would encourage folks to think about developing locally. It would be difficult for the state to develop a comprehensive list that is accurate and maintained for the 58 counties and all the organizations in those counties, but definitely the things that can be developed locally between CBOs and CWDs, this is an example. A local list of folks who are ready and able to engage with our ABAWDs who are subject to the time limit for volunteer work, community service, and so on. So definitely a great idea looking forward as part of your planning. Okay, just give us a minute here to catch up on some additional questions. Okay, here's another question going back to self-attestation or client statement. So, oh, hold on, my computer just bumped the question. Here we go. So would we be able to accept self-attestation for earned income when the job has just been started and no documentary evidence is available to establish hours worked? This would be in line with income verification.
Yeah, so for the purpose of the ABAWD work requirement, they do have to have shown that they have worked the 20 hours per week or 80 hours per month prior to satisfying the work requirement.
So at application, what the client is showing you is that they have met the 20 hour per week or 80 hour per month averaged work requirement in order to maintain eligibility. So it would be a tricky situation if the person had a job moving forward that they may not have started yet.
And again, in that first initial month, it's a partial month, so they wouldn't be required to meet the work requirement in that initial month. And so at that point, again, the responsibility to report is on the client. So the next month, if their hours did drop, they would have the responsibility to report that to the county.
All right. Okay. Here's another question. If a client reports SAR-7, let's say, that they have not worked for a few months, so they failed to meet their required report, do we have to go back and count those months
and you can give us a little preview of next month's webinar.
Yeah, so there's a couple of options here, but the general answer is yes, that you would have to go back and assign countable months for any months in which the ABAWD client did not meet the work requirement. So we will be talking about that next month during the webinar, and there's also the option for the 15% exemption, which we'll also be talking in a later webinar. So there's a couple of different avenues you could take in that situation, but definitely you would have to at least at minimum apply a 15 or a countable month, depending on the scenario.
All right, and I think we're going to hit our last question for today. And I think this is just a point of clarification.
Sure.
Why is WIOA's job search component an ABAWD approved component, but not a county administered job search component? So I think there's actually some clarification here, because county administered job search is allowable, just under a different a slightly different set of rules.
Yeah, there's the rule distinction for county administered job search is just that it cannot equal more than half of the combined hour total, so up to 9 hours.
And that distinction is in federal regulations, not something we would have created for ourselves,
right.
But it's specific to CalFresh Employment and Training Job Search.
Yes, correct.
And that's different from something like a WIOA job search, which the client can participate in for 20 hours a week.
Yes, correct.
All right, so looking at the clock here, we're going to wrap up. We have a few additional questions. We will follow up with folks. We will get the PowerPoint slides out to participants.
Yes.
As well, we are tracking the Q&A from all of the webinars. I know there have been some questions about can the questions come out to folks, and we'll be working to organize those. So not to worry, lots of follow-up. But I'll let Amber close us out.
Yeah, so our slides are displaying a little. There we go. Let me see if I can get this up. There we go. Hopefully folks can see that. Perfect. So just wanted to show again what we have coming up next in our webinar training series. So next month we'll be discussing counting months. And then a lot of the questions that have come in from this webinar we'll use to inform the content for that one. So thank you so much for entering in those great questions. The next slide has, again, just a list of resources that are linked with ACINs and ACLs that are helpful when navigating the ABAWD time limit. And then just finally, thank you so much for everyone's continued participation in these monthly webinars. Hoping that the content is relevant and that you're getting some great information. And as always, feedback is appreciated, so please send any questions or follow-up comments to myself, Sydney, or Danielle. And other than that, have a great rest of your Tuesday.